Imagine this, you're standing in the cold stone chamber of a medieval tower as the clock begins its slow march toward midnight. The walls around you are ancient, built from stones carved with symbols no living scholar can decipher. Outside, the wind howls through the battlements of one of the most beautiful castles in all of Europe. But beauty is deceiving, because in this tower, in this very room where you now stand, a curse waits. A curse so powerful, so unrelenting, that anyone who dares to sleep here will be dead within a year. Not might die, will die. The midnight bell tolls 12 times, and with each chime, your fate is sealed. This is not a story. This is not legend. This is Zvíkov Castle, where the lords who tempted fate learned that some rules cannot be broken, and some nights should never be spent alone in the darkness. What you just heard isn't the plot of a horror novel. It's a genuine medieval legend that has persisted for centuries, surrounding one of the Czech Republic's most magnificent and most haunted fortresses. For this video, I've spent weeks researching the dark history of Zvíkov Castle, poring through historical records, paranormal investigations, and first-hand accounts from visitors who experienced something they couldn't explain. I've examined siege records from the Hussite Wars, studied the architectural mysteries of its ancient towers, and traced the bloodline of every noble family who ever called this place home. What makes this castle different from the hundreds of other supposedly haunted medieval fortresses scattered across Europe? 3 compelling questions that we're going to answer today. First, why does the legend specifically state that anyone who sleeps in the main tower will die within a year, and has anyone actually tested this curse? Second, what connection exists between the mysterious stones marked with undecipherable symbols and the supernatural entities that allegedly inhabit the castle? And third, how did a fortress that successfully defended against a siege of 4,000 soldiers with only 140 men become synonymous with death, curses, and paranormal activity? This investigation goes far beyond surface-level ghost stories. We're diving into authenticated historical records, examining the architectural peculiarities that might explain some phenomena, and exploring the documented cases of unexplained deaths, technical malfunctions, and supernatural encounters that continue to this day. The castle we're exploring today isn't some crumbling ruin lost to time. It's a fully restored early Gothic masterpiece that attracts thousands of visitors every year, many of whom leave with experiences they struggle to rationalize. High above the confluence where the Vltava and Otava rivers merge their ancient waters, perched on a steep promontory of rock that juts from the landscape like a stone sentinel, stands Zvíkov Castle. The Czechs call it the King of Castles, and once you see it rising from its strategic position, surrounded by sweeping forests and commanding views that stretch for miles in every direction, you understand why. This is not some minor fortification hastily thrown together during a border dispute. This is a monument to power, to Gothic architecture at its finest, and to the blood-soaked history of medieval Bohemia. The castle's origins trace back to the early 13th century. The first written mention of Zvíkov comes from the year 1234, when it was already owned by the kings of Bohemia. While historians believe it was most likely commissioned by King Přemysl Otakar I, the exact date of construction and the identity of its founder remain uncertain. What is clear is that Zvíkov was conceived as a royal stronghold, a place so important that it would eventually serve as the treasury for the Bohemian crown jewels themselves, at least until the construction of Karlstein Castle. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, the most precious symbols of an entire kingdom's authority, locked away in these very towers, protected by walls and men sworn to die before allowing them to fall into enemy hands. The location was chosen with military genius. Anyone attempting to approach the castle would have to cross one of 2 rivers or scale the near vertical cliff faces that nature had carved from the earth. The promontory itself was a natural fortress, and the medieval architects enhanced what nature provided, building layer upon layer of defensive walls, towers that could survey the entire valley, and fortifications that would prove their worth time and time again through centuries of warfare. But there was something else here, something unusual. When builders constructed certain parts of the castle, particularly the towers, they used stones that bore strange carvings. According to some accounts, these carved stones were gathered from ancient ruins throughout the region, possibly dating back to the 1st and 2nd centuries when Germanic tribes, including the Marcomanni, inhabited Bohemia. Whether these stones were intentionally sought out for their markings or simply repurposed from available ruins remains unknown. What is certain is that these aren't ordinary building materials. The symbols and figures carved into them have resisted all attempts at translation, leaving scholars to speculate about their original purpose. The oldest structure in the entire castle complex is Hlíza Tower, also known ominously as the Black Tower. This massive prismatic residential tower rises with thick walls constructed from layers of black squared stone blocks. Built around 1230 as the core of the original fortification, Hlíza incorporated many of those mysterious carved stones into its very structure. Walk through Hlíza today and you can still see them, marked with symbols that modern scholars have failed to decipher. Some researchers have theorized these markings might be necromantic in nature, ancient attempts to bind spirits or channel supernatural forces, though this remains pure speculation. What cannot be disputed is that Hlíza Tower would become the focal point of Zvíkov's most terrifying legend. As the centuries progressed, Zvíkov grew from a small royal complex into the massive fortified behemoth we see today. During the reign of King Przemysl Ottokar II in the latter 13th century, the castle saw major expansion with the construction of a lavish new palace called Królewski, or the King's Own. New towers rose, the fortifications were strengthened. The chapel of St. Wenceslaus would later be adorned with elaborate murals in 1473 that art historians consider masterpieces of early Gothic Czech architecture. By the time the 14th century arrived, Zvíkov was at the height of its power and prestige, a symbol of Bohemian royal authority that could be seen for miles around. The castle passed through the hands of the Rosenberg family, one of the most powerful and influential noble houses in all of Bohemia. They held it even though Emperor Charles IV himself had declared that Zvíkov should never be pawned or sold, that it should remain forever in royal hands. But empires fall, dynasties end, and rules made by dead emperors are easily broken by living men who see opportunity in chaos. The Rosenbergs transformed Zvíkov into their personal seat of power, adding their own architectural touches and cementing their control over the strategic river crossing below. Yet, for all its beauty, for all its strategic importance, for all the wealth and power concentrated within its walls, there was always something unsettling about Zvíkov. The local people whispered about it. Servants who worked there spoke of rooms that grew inexplicably cold, of sounds that echoed through empty corridors, of presences that watched from the shadows. These weren't the idle superstitions of ignorant peasants. These were consistent reports from people who lived and worked within the castle's walls, people who knew every stone and every passage, yet still felt that they were never truly alone. Now we come to the heart of darkness, the legend that has defined Zvíkov Castle for generations and turned it into one of the most feared locations in all of the Czech Republic. The curse is simple in its statement, but terrifying in its implications. Anyone who sleeps in Hlíza Tower, the Black Tower with its ancient marked stones and mysterious origins, will die within 1 year. Not might die from some vague illness or unlikely accident. Will die. The curse makes no exceptions for rank, wealth, piety, or skepticism. Sleep in that tower at night and your days are numbered. This isn't some recent invention designed to attract tourists or sell ghost tour tickets. The legend of the tower's deadly curse has been passed down through generations of Czech families, embedded in local folklore with the same certainty as historical facts about sieges and royal succession. Parents warned their children, travelers avoided accepting hospitality that would place them in that cursed chamber. Even the nobles who owned the castle knew better than to spend a night within Hlíza's thick stone walls. But what makes this curse particularly chilling is its specificity about timing. The danger isn't simply sleeping in the tower. The critical moment comes at midnight, when the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond grows thin. Midnight has always held special significance in supernatural lore across cultures. It's the witching hour, the time when spirits walk most freely, when protective charms grow weak, and when the normal laws of nature seem suspended. In Zvíkov's Hlíza Tower, midnight is when the curse activates, when whatever malevolent force inhabits that space marks its victim and begins the countdown to their death. Think about the psychology of this curse for a moment. It doesn't promise instant death. That would almost be merciful. Instead, it gives you a year, a full rotation of the seasons, time enough to visit physicians, to pray to saints, to settle your affairs and watch helplessly as the days tick away. Imagine the terror of knowing that your death is coming, that you've been marked by something you can't fight, can't reason with, can't escape. Some who allegedly fell victim to the curse tried everything. They traveled to distant lands, thinking physical distance might break the spell. They surrounded themselves with holy relics and paid for masses to be said for their souls. None of it mattered. The curse found them. The source of this deadly power has been the subject of much speculation. One theory suggests it might be connected to those ancient carved stones we discussed earlier, particularly concentrated in Hlíza and the Markomanka Tower. Some paranormal researchers have proposed that Zvíkov wasn't simply built for military purposes, but was constructed in part as a kind of spiritual prison, designed to contain supernatural forces. In this interpretation, the mysterious symbols on the stones would be binding spells, formulas meant to trap entities within the castle's walls. Whether there's any truth to such theories is impossible to verify, but they offer one possible explanation for why spending the night in Hlíza Tower with its high concentration of these marked stones might be particularly dangerous. But has anyone actually died from the curse? This is where historical records become frustratingly vague, as they often do with supernatural claims. There are no castle ledgers listing cause of death as Curse of Hlíza Tower. Medieval and Renaissance record-keeping, while sometimes remarkably detailed about matters of taxes and property, rarely bothered to document the circumstances of common deaths, and nobles who died under suspicious or shameful circumstances were often granted discreet burials with minimal written explanation. What we do have are persistent local traditions and stories passed down through families who lived in the region for generations. Tales of visiting dignitaries who accepted the Lord's hospitality, slept in the tower chamber, and died of mysterious ailments within the year. Accounts of castle garrison soldiers who took bets on the curse's validity, spent a night in Hlíza as a test of courage, and subsequently perished in accidents that seemed too coincidental to be purely natural. These stories may not satisfy modern standards of evidence, but they created a reputation so powerful that even today, castle staff won't spend the night in that tower, and the few tourists brave or foolish enough to request it are politely but firmly refused. The midnight aspect of the curse adds another layer of terror. Midnight doesn't just mark the beginning of a new day in our modern conception. In medieval understanding, midnight was the inversion of noon, the moment when the sun's power and God's watchful eye were furthest from the earth. It was when demons held the most sway, when protective prayers lost their strength, when the barriers between the living world and the realm of the dead grew permeable. To be in Hlíza Tower at midnight was to be at the epicenter of supernatural danger, in a place where ancient stones held ancient curses at a time when those curses had maximum power to manifest. Modern visitors to Zvíkov have reported deeply unsettling experiences even during daytime tours of the tower. Sudden temperature drops that leave them shivering despite warm weather outside. A sense of being watched by hostile presences. Unexplained mechanical failures of cameras and electronic equipment. Some have described feeling an overwhelming compulsion to leave, a primal fear response that drove them from the tower despite their rational minds. insisting there was nothing to fear. If this is what happens during safe daytime visits, imagine the psychological and possibly supernatural assault of spending an entire night there, alone, as the clock approaches midnight. If the curse of Hlíza Tower is Zvíkov's most infamous legend, then the Zvíkovský Rarashek is its most famous supernatural resident. The name translates roughly to Zvíkov's imp or Zvíkov's devil, and this mischievous, malevolent entity has been terrorizing visitors to the castle since at least 1597, when the first documented accounts of its activities began to circulate through Bohemia. The Rarashek is a creature from Slavic folklore, a type of trickster spirit that falls somewhere between a demon and a goblin. Unlike the grand, terrifying demons of Christian theology, a Rarashek operates on a more intimate, personal scale of torment. It doesn't drag souls to hell or possess the innocent. Instead, it pokes you. It trips you. It moves your belongings. It extinguishes your candles just as you're trying to read an important document. It makes you look foolish, scares you senseless, and occasionally, if the mood strikes it, causes your death through carefully orchestrated accidents. The Zvíkov imp is said to haunt primarily two towers within the castle complex. The first is Markomanka Tower, among the most ancient parts of the structure. According to local tradition, Markomanka is notable for stones carved with mysterious symbols incorporated into its walls. Legend holds that this tower, or at least some of its materials, dates back to the era when Germanic tribes, including the Marcomanni, inhabited the region in the 1st and 2nd centuries, though the tower itself was integrated into the castle complex in the 13th century. The symbols carved into these stones are particularly dense here, particularly complex, and particularly resistant to any scholarly attempt at translation. The second tower associated with the imp is Hlíza, the Black Tower, the same location of the Midnight Death Curse. This connection likely isn't coincidental. Both the curse and the imp's presence concentrate in the oldest parts of the castle, the sections with the mysterious carved stones, which has led some to theorize that whatever supernatural forces inhabit Zvíkov might be connected to these ancient materials and whatever purposes they originally served. What makes the Zvíkovský Rarashek particularly unsettling is the specific nature of its activities. This isn't a vague atmospheric haunting. People report physical contact. They feel pushes, jabs, and tugs on their clothing. They experience being tripped on staircases, a potentially deadly prank in a medieval castle filled with steep stone steps and unforgiving floors. The imp seems to particularly delight in humiliating or frightening visitors, waiting until they're in vulnerable positions before making its presence known. Animals, with their reputedly keener senses for supernatural presence, absolutely refuse to enter the areas where the imp dwells. Dogs that normally obey commands without hesitation will plant their feet and refuse to cross the threshold into Markomanka or Hlíza. Horses become agitated and unmanageable. Birds go silent. Even rats, those ubiquitous inhabitants of old castles, avoid certain chambers. The animals' reactions provide compelling evidence that something genuinely anomalous exists in these spaces, something that triggers deep instinctual fear responses that override training and domestication. The imp's reputation for causing technical malfunctions deserves special attention, because these reports come from the modern era and can't be dismissed as medieval superstition. Visitors attempting to photograph or film in the towers report camera batteries draining instantly despite being fully charged moments before. Digital equipment displays error messages or shuts down completely. Even simple mechanical devices like flashlights flicker and fail. One paranormal investigation team reported that every piece of electromagnetic field detection equipment they brought malfunctioned simultaneously upon entering Markomanka, devices that had worked perfectly in dozens of other supposedly haunted locations. Electromagnetic anomalies are a consistent feature of Zvíkov's haunting. Visitors with no ghost hunting equipment report their cell phones behaving strangely, compasses spinning without finding north, and even wristwatches running backward or stopping entirely. Some researchers have theorized that the mysterious carved stones might contain unusual mineral compositions that create natural electromagnetic fields, which could potentially explain some of these effects. However, this geological explanation struggles to account for the seemingly intelligent, purposeful nature of many incidents. A random magnetic field doesn't wait until you're framing the perfect photograph to drain your battery. It doesn't specifically target the equipment of skeptics while leaving believers' devices functioning. The pattern suggests intention, which suggests intelligence, which suggests something far more disturbing than geological anomalies. Fire, that most fundamental human technology, behaves unpredictably in the imp's domain. Candles extinguish with no breeze to explain it. Torches gutter and die despite fresh fuel. Modern visitors have watched lighters fail repeatedly, only to work perfectly the moment they leave the affected area. In the medieval period, when fire was literally the difference between seeing and blindness, warmth and freezing, safety and terror, an entity that could control flame was terrifying indeed. The psychological impact of having your light source suddenly extinguished in the depths of a dark tower cannot be overstated. The Zvíkovský Rarachek has become such a significant part of Czech culture that it inspired a theatrical comedy opera in the 19th century, written by playwright Ladislav Stropečnický. The work, titled simply Zvíkovský Rarachek, portrayed the imp as a mischievous but ultimately harmless figure, the sort of whimsical supernatural pest that makes for light entertainment. But the imp apparently didn't appreciate being made into a comedic character. Multiple film productions that attempted to shoot scenes at Zvíkov based on Stropečnicky's work experienced bizarre technical difficulties, accidents, and setbacks that drove costs over budget and left directors swearing they'd never return to the castle. Equipment malfunctions, unexplained sounds that ruined takes, crew members falling ill, film stock developing with mysterious shadows and figures not present during shooting. The pattern of problems was so consistent that some productions simply relocated to other castles rather than continue fighting whatever force seemed determined to sabotage their work. Modern paranormal investigators who've studied the imp phenomenon report a distinct sense of intelligence behind the manifestations. This isn't random spiritual energy or residual haunting, the supernatural equivalent of a recording playing over and over. The Rarachek responds to people. It seems to have preferences, targeting certain individuals while leaving others alone. It appears to enjoy causing fear and confusion, suggesting a personality, an agenda, perhaps even emotions like amusement or anger. Some who've encountered it describe the feeling of being watched by something that understands human psychology and knows exactly how to exploit our fears. There are darker implications to the imp's legend beyond mere mischief. The Rarachek is also credited with causing disease and death, either through direct supernatural harm or by creating dangerous situations that lead to fatal accidents. That push on the stairs could result in a broken neck. That extinguished torch could lead to a fatal misstep in the dark. That inexplicable illness that strikes someone down might be the imp's doing, a curse laid by an angry spirit that has been trapped in stone and darkness for over 1,000 years. The line between harmful prank and murder becomes very thin when you're dealing with an entity that exists outside normal moral constraints and has been imprisoned for centuries with nothing but rage and resentment for company. But the Zvíkovský Rarachek isn't the only supernatural entity said to inhabit the castle's corridors and chambers. Zvíkov has collected ghosts the way old buildings collect dust, layer upon layer of spiritual residue left behind by centuries of violence, tragedy, and death. Each apparition has its own story, its own reason for remaining bound to this place long after death should have freed them. The White Lady, or Lady in White as she's sometimes called, is perhaps the second most famous ghost of Zvíkov after the imp itself. She appears as a young woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, wandering the castle's halls and towers with an expression of profound sadness. Her identity has been the subject of much speculation and local folklore. The most widely told story identifies her as Markéta, daughter of a 16th century castle caretaker, though, like many ghost legends, the historical basis for this tale is difficult to verify. According to legend, Markéta fell in love with a young nobleman who frequented Zvíkov. Their romance was passionate but forbidden. The class difference between a caretaker's daughter and a nobleman made marriage impossible in the rigid social hierarchy of medieval and Renaissance society. When Markéta's father discovered the relationship, he was furious, not just at his daughter's disobedience, but at the scandal it would bring to his position. He locked her in one of the castle's towers, imprisoning her to prevent further contact with her lover and to punish her defiance. Trapped, heartbroken, and seeing no future where she could be with the man she loved, Markéta made a desperate decision. She climbed to the top of the tower where she was imprisoned and threw herself from the window, plunging into the river far below. Her body was recovered and buried, but her spirit never left. From shortly after her death to the present day, visitors and staff have reported seeing a young woman in white wandering the castle, particularly near the tower where she was imprisoned. She's often heard sobbing, a heartbreaking sound that echoes through empty corridors. Some witnesses have reported seeing her walk directly through solid walls, following paths that might have existed in the castle's earlier configurations. In the 20th century, a group of archaeologists working on restoration efforts at the tower reported a terrifying encounter with what they believed was Markéta's ghost. They were excavating in the area where she had been imprisoned, carefully documenting their findings and taking measurements by lantern light as evening approached. Suddenly, with no warning, a powerful gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing all their lanterns simultaneously, despite the fact that they were in an enclosed space with no windows open. In the darkness, they heard a woman's voice speaking in Czech, though they couldn't make out the words. Terrified, they abandoned their equipment and fled the tower, refusing to return even to retrieve their tools. They reported the incident officially, and their testimony is preserved in the archaeological survey records, though skeptics naturally attribute the experience to overactive imaginations and coincidental gusts of wind. The White Lady's appearances seem to increase during certain times of year, particularly around the anniversary of her death. Some witnesses report that she doesn't seem to notice the living at all, as if she's trapped in a loop, reliving her final tragic days over and over. Others claim she makes eye contact, and her expression is one of such profound sorrow that it brings them to tears. A few brave or foolish individuals have attempted to communicate with her, but she's never been known to respond beyond her endless weeping and wandering. Descending deeper into Zvíkov's mysteries, we come to perhaps its most terrifying claimed inhabitants, the hellhounds that allegedly guard the secret passages in the catacombs beneath the castle. These aren't the friendly castle dogs that might have lived here in medieval times. According to legend, these are supernatural creatures, demonic guardians, set to protect something hidden deep in the underground chambers, something so valuable or dangerous that it requires otherworldly sentries. Firehounds, as they're called in Czech folklore, are common figures in Slavic supernatural tradition. They're described as large black dogs with eyes that glow like coals, creatures that appear at crossroads, graveyards, and places where the barrier between worlds grows thin. Their appearance is universally considered an omen of death. To see one is to know that you or someone close to you will die soon. To hear their howling is to receive a warning. To be pursued by one is to face certain doom. The catacombs of Zvíkov are extensive, carved from the rock beneath the castle and extending in networks that haven't been fully mapped even today. Some passages were obviously designed as storage areas or escape routes. Others seem to serve no clear purpose, dead-ending in chambers whose function remains mysterious. It's in these deeper, less explored sections that people report hearing the howling and strange sounds that they attribute to the hellhounds. Maintenance workers who must occasionally venture into the catacombs for repairs or inspections report an overwhelming sense of being followed in certain passages. They hear breathing behind them, the clicking of claws on stone, low growls that seem to come from the darkness just beyond their light. Some have reported seeing glowing eyes in the distance, watching them. These aren't reports from superstitious medieval peasants. These are modern workers, electricians, and maintenance staff, people with no particular belief in the supernatural, who emerge from the catacombs pale and shaking, swearing they experienced something down there that defies rational explanation. What the hellhounds might be guarding remains a mystery, though theories abound. Some believe there's a hidden chamber containing treasure, gold, and jewels, hidden during one of the many wars that swept through the region and never recovered. Others think the secret is more occult in nature, forbidden texts or artifacts of dark magic that were sealed away for good reason. A few researchers have suggested that the entire catacomb network might have been part of an elaborate ritual system designed to channel supernatural energies using the same principles as the marked stones in the towers above. Shadow figures represent another class of entity frequently reported at Zvíkov. Unlike the White Lady, who has a defined appearance and apparent identity, shadow figures are exactly what they sound like: dark, human-shaped silhouettes that move independently of any light source that could cast them. They appear in peripheral vision, dart across doorways, or stand motionless in corridors, watching. Multiple visitors have photographed these shadow figures, and while skeptics rightfully point out that odd shadows in old buildings can be created by complex interactions of light sources, some of the images are genuinely difficult to explain. Humanoid shapes appearing in photographs where no person was standing. Dark figures clearly visible in one frame of a video sequence, completely absent in the frame before and after. The consistency of reports is what makes shadow figures particularly interesting. Different people, visiting at different times with no knowledge of previous accounts, describe seeing the same phenomena in the same locations. Some paranormal researchers theorize that shadow figures might be spiritual entities that haven't manifested fully into our reality, existing in some intermediate state between worlds. Others believe they're the spirits of people who died so suddenly or traumatically that they don't even realize they're dead, their consciousness trapped in a confused state. At Zvíkov, with its centuries of warfare, siege, and violent death, there would be no shortage of traumatized spirits unable to move on. The electromagnetic disturbances reported throughout the castle add another dimension to the haunting. Visitors consistently report their electronic devices malfunctioning in specific areas, even when those devices worked perfectly moments before. Batteries drain completely in minutes. Digital cameras display impossible dates or fail to record. Cell phone compasses spin wildly. Some people report feeling static electricity building up on their skin, their hair standing on end as if they're in an electrically charged environment. These electromagnetic effects have led some researchers to propose that Zvíkov might sit on a geological formation that generates unusual magnetic or electric fields. Certain types of rock can create natural electromagnetic anomalies that might affect both human perception, potentially causing hallucinations or feelings of unease, and electronic equipment. However, this geological explanation struggles to account for the intelligence and apparent intentionality behind many of the phenomena. A magnetic field doesn't choose to activate only when someone is trying to document something unusual. It doesn't target specific individuals while leaving others unaffected. It doesn't create phenomena that respond to human behavior and seem to have purposes beyond simple physical effects. The cumulative effect of all these different types of manifestations, the curse, the imp, the White Lady, the hellhounds, the shadow figures, and the electromagnetic anomalies, creates an atmosphere at Zvíkov that even skeptics find unsettling. This isn't a place where you can easily dismiss every strange occurrence as imagination or coincidence. The reports are too consistent, too specific, too diverse in their sources. Something is happening at Zvíkov Castle, something that has been happening for centuries and shows no signs of stopping. To understand why Zvíkov might be so saturated with supernatural activity, we need to examine the extraordinary violence and tragedy that soaked into its stones over centuries of warfare. Haunted locations aren't random. They're places where human suffering reached such intensity that it seems to leave a permanent mark, an imprint on reality itself, that sensitive individuals can perceive long after the events have passed into history. The Hussite Wars of the 15th century were among the bloodiest religious conflicts in European history, and Zvíkov found itself directly in the path of this apocalyptic storm. The Hussites were followers of Jan Hus, a religious reformer who challenged the Catholic Church's authority and was burned at the stake for heresy in 1415. His death ignited Bohemia. Peasants and nobles who supported reform rose up, and what followed was decades of warfare that killed hundreds of thousands and devastated the entire region. In 1429, during the height of these wars, Hussite forces laid siege to Zvíkov. They surrounded the castle, cutting off all supplies, and settled in for a war of attrition. The siege lasted 4 months. 4 months of slowly starving defenders watching the enemy camps beyond the walls, knowing that relief wasn't coming, that they would eventually have to surrender or die. We don't have detailed records of casualties during this siege, but medieval sieges were horrific experiences. Disease spread rapidly in the confined, unsanitary conditions. Food ran out. The dead had to be disposed of somehow, and when you're trapped inside walls, options are limited. The psychological toll of siege warfare cannot be overstated. You're trapped, helpless, watching your supplies dwindle while knowing that when they run out, you face either execution or enslavement. Every morning you wake up wondering if this will be the day the walls are breached. Every night you listen to the enemy outside, sometimes so close you can hear their conversations. The stress, the fear, the despair, these emotions would have permeated every stone. But Zvíkov's defenders held. The fortifications proved too strong, the natural defenses of the promontory too formidable. After 4 months, the Hussites abandoned the siege, unable to take the castle. Zvíkov had survived one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 15th century, its walls unbreached. Yet the experience of that long siege, the suffering endured within those walls, would have left its mark on the place itself. The castle's greatest test, however, was yet to come. In 1618, as the 30 Years' War erupted across Europe, Zvíkov became a focal point of conflict once again. This time, the castle was held by Protestant nobles who had rebelled against Habsburg Catholic authority. They garrisoned Zvíkov with 140 men and prepared to defend it against the imperial forces. The Habsburgs arrived with 4,000 soldiers, 4,000 trained, equipped troops against 140 defenders. The mathematics of warfare suggested this would be a brief engagement, a day or two before the defenders recognized the impossibility of their situation and surrendered. But Zvíkov's defenders had the advantage of those incredible fortifications, walls that had been built and rebuilt over 4 centuries, towers that commanded every approach, and the desperate courage of men who knew that surrender likely meant execution. The siege that followed became legendary. For weeks, the garrison of 140 held off an army 30 times their size. They fought from the walls, poured boiling oil on attackers trying to scale the cliffs, and made every meter of ground cost the Habsburgs dearly. Imagine being one of those defenders, watching the endless sea of enemy troops surrounding your position, knowing that you're vastly outnumbered but fighting anyway, because surrender isn't an option, because these walls are all that stand between you and death. But courage and strong walls can only accomplish so much against overwhelming force. In October 1622, the defenders finally capitulated. They had fought as long as humanly possible, but they were out of food, out of arrows, out of hope. The terms of surrender were harsh. The Habsburg forces entered the castle and began the looting. Everything of value was taken. Furnishings, weapons, artwork, supplies, even the personal belongings of the defenders were stripped away. But worse than the material loss was what came next. The castle was systematically vandalized. What couldn't be carried off was destroyed. Windows were smashed, tapestries torn, murals defaced. Some accounts suggest that defenders were executed despite the terms of surrender, though the exact details have been lost to history. What is certain is that when you combine those killed during the active siege with the violence that followed, Zvíkov absorbed an enormous amount of human suffering during those terrible weeks of 1622. After 1622, Zvíkov never truly recovered its former glory. The Schwamberg family attempted some restoration in the 1640s, but by then the castle's strategic importance was waning. Gunpowder artillery had changed warfare, and the thick walls that had withstood medieval sieges were vulnerable to cannon fire. Zvíkov's purpose shifted from military stronghold to agricultural center, a far less glamorous role for the King of Czech Castles. Then, In 1751, fire swept through significant portions of the castle complex. Fire was the great terror of medieval and early modern buildings. Once it took hold in a structure built primarily of wood and cloth, with timber roof beams and vast stores of flammable materials, there was often little that could be done to stop it. The 1751 fire at Zvíkov destroyed interiors that had survived the wars, consumed irreplaceable artwork and furnishings, and left whole sections as blackened, smoke-damaged shells. By the 1840s, Zvíkov had declined to the point of being essentially a ruin. The once mighty fortress was a crumbling embarrassment, a reminder of past glory that now served only to house farm animals and store grain. But the Schwarzenberg family, the aristocratic house that then owned the property, decided to invest enormous sums in a comprehensive restoration. It was a massive undertaking, requiring skilled craftsmen to rebuild collapsed sections, restore damaged murals, and shore up walls that had been slowly disintegrating for a century. The restoration efforts faced their own strange obstacles. One of the massive gates collapsed during reconstruction, killing workers. A large portion of the royal palace crumbled into the river below without warning, as if the castle was resisting attempts to revive it. Workers reported unsettling experiences, feelings of being watched, tools that went missing and reappeared in impossible locations, and the constant sense that they were intruding on something that wanted to be left alone. Think about the layers of trauma embedded in Zvíkov stones: Hussite siege warfare, 30 years war combat and execution, looting, vandalism, destruction, fire, decades of abandonment and decay, every era of violence, every death, every moment of terror and suffering, all of it absorbed by the ancient stones, some of which were already over 1,000 years old when the castle was built. Is it any wonder that visitors report feeling oppressed by the atmosphere? That they sense anger and pain radiating from the walls? That the place seems to remember every drop of blood that soaked into its foundations? The restoration of Zvíkov in the 19th century returned it to something approaching its former architectural glory, but it did nothing to quiet the supernatural activity that had been building for centuries. If anything, the renovations may have stirred up dormant forces, disturbing spirits that had been resting and reminding them that the living still walked these halls. The 20th century brought a new type of visitor to Zvíkov, not just tourists admiring Gothic architecture, but paranormal investigators armed with electromagnetic field detectors, thermal cameras, digital recorders, and a scientific approach to documenting supernatural phenomena. These researchers have produced some of the most compelling evidence for Zvíkov's haunted nature, though they've also experienced the castle's apparent hostility to being studied. One of the most consistent findings from paranormal investigations is the electromagnetic anomaly we've mentioned before. EMF detectors, devices designed to measure electromagnetic fields, go haywire in certain parts of the castle, particularly in and around Markomanka Tower and Hlíza. These spikes in electromagnetic energy have no obvious source. They appear suddenly, reach levels far higher than background radiation, persist for minutes or hours, then disappear just as mysteriously as they arrived. Some researchers have proposed that these electromagnetic fields might be responsible for many of the subjective experiences people report. High levels of electromagnetic energy can affect the human brain, potentially causing hallucinations, feelings of being watched, paranoia, and even physical sensations like the feeling of being touched. Rooms with high EMF levels are often described as feeling oppressive or wrong, and people exposed to strong electromagnetic fields sometimes report seeing shadows or figures in their peripheral vision. This theory is scientifically plausible and would explain many of Zvíkov's phenomena in purely natural terms. However, it fails to account for several aspects of the castle's haunting. First, the intelligent, purposeful nature of many manifestations doesn't fit with random electromagnetic effects. Second, the historical consistency of reports spanning centuries, long before modern electronic devices existed that electromagnetic fields could interfere with. Third, the specific repeated nature of certain phenomena, like the imp's pranks or the White Lady's appearances in particular locations. And fourth, the reported presence of the entities themselves, which electromagnetic field theory can't explain beyond suggesting they're hallucinations. Thermal imaging cameras have captured interesting anomalies at Zvíkov. These devices detect infrared radiation and create images based on temperature differences, allowing investigators to see heat signatures invisible to the naked eye. Multiple investigations have recorded sudden cold spots in rooms with no draft or obvious cooling source. These aren't minor temperature fluctuations. We're talking about drops of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in localized areas, spheres of intense cold that move through space independently of any air current. Cold spots are a classic feature of haunted location reports, and various theories attempt to explain them. Some paranormal researchers believe that spirits must draw energy from their environment to manifest, and extracting thermal energy from the air would create observable cold spots. Skeptics point out that old buildings often have unpredictable air currents, and that temperature readings can be affected by numerous factors. However, the cold spots at Zvíkov often appear on thermal cameras in ways that seem to respond to human presence or specific events, appearing when investigators ask questions or moving in patterns that suggest intention rather than random air movement. Digital voice recorders have captured what paranormal investigators call electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. These are sounds often resembling voices that appear on recordings but weren't audible to the human ear at the time of recording. Skeptics rightfully point out that digital recording devices can pick up all sorts of ambient noise, radio interference, and artifacts of the recording process itself that might be mistaken for voices. But some of the EVP captured at Zvíkov is remarkably clear, forming Czech words and phrases that seem to respond to investigators' questions. One team recorded what sounded like a woman weeping in Hlíza Tower, the sound so clear and so anguished that when they reviewed the footage later, some team members were reduced to tears themselves. Other recordings include footsteps crossing empty rooms, doors opening and closing in areas where all the doors were secured, and in one particularly unsettling case, what sounds like someone breathing directly into the microphone, despite the recorder being placed alone in a sealed room. Photography at Zvíkov produces its own anomalies. Digital cameras malfunction with unusual frequency, but the images captured before they fail sometimes contain unexplained elements. Orbs, which are spherical artifacts that skeptics correctly identify as usually being dust particles or moisture reflecting the camera flash, appear in unusual patterns at Zvíkov, moving in ways that seem to defy simple explanations of airborne particles. Shadow figures appear in photographs, human-shaped dark areas that don't correspond to any physical object that could cast such a shadow. In a few particularly striking images, faces appear in windows of rooms that investigators confirm were empty at the time the photo was taken. Personal experiences from investigators range from mildly unsettling to genuinely terrifying. Feelings of being touched or pushed are common, particularly on the staircases. Investigators report hearing their names called by voices that sound like other team members, only to discover that everyone is accounted for and no one called out. Items go missing and reappear in different locations. Equipment that was functioning perfectly stops working, then resumes normal operation the moment investigators leave the affected area. One particularly well-documented incident involved a paranormal research team that brought in specialized equipment to measure magnetic fields, temperature, and electromagnetic radiation in Hlíza Tower. They set up their instruments, calibrated everything, and began recording. Within minutes, every single piece of equipment simultaneously malfunctioned. Batteries that had been fully charged showed zero power. Devices that didn't rely on batteries but ran on different power sources all stopped working. The team was plunged into darkness as their flashlights died. In the silence that followed, they heard footsteps approaching them up the tower stairs, deliberate footfalls getting closer and closer. No one was there. They fled the tower, and once they were outside, every piece of equipment began working normally again. Some investigators report more subtle but equally disturbing experiences, a sense of time distortion, where they believe they've been in a room for minutes only to discover hours have passed, feelings of intense dread or sadness that hit them suddenly and overwhelmingly, emotions that feel external, imposed by the location rather than arising from their own minds. A few have reported what they describe as attack, physical illness, scratches appearing on their skin, or psychological effects that persisted long after leaving the castle. The Czech paranormal research community has extensively documented Zvíkov, and the castle has become a sort of testing ground for investigative techniques and equipment. Some researchers believe that the concentration of supernatural activity makes it an ideal location for developing and refining methods of detecting and documenting paranormal phenomena. Others have sworn never to return after experiences that left them genuinely afraid. Modern visitors without paranormal investigation equipment still report experiences. Tourist reviews and social media posts consistently mention feelings of unease in certain areas, particularly the towers. People describe being overcome by sadness for no reason, feeling watched, or experiencing sudden temperature changes. Some report vertigo or nausea in specific rooms. Photographs fail to capture images even though the camera appears to be functioning. Videos show strange artifacts, unexplained sounds, or visual anomalies that weren't noticed during filming. The castle staff, people who work there regularly and know every stone and every passage, have their own collection of stories. They've learned which areas to avoid at certain times. They've developed informal protocols for dealing with the unusual. No one enters Hlíza Tower alone. No one works in Markomanka after dark if they can help it. Equipment that malfunctions in specific areas is simply accepted as a normal aspect of working at Zvíkov. The staff might not discuss it with tourists, but among themselves, they acknowledge that the castle has phenomena that resist rational explanation. Czech Republic's most important cultural and historical monuments. It's been beautifully restored, its Gothic architecture preserved for future generations, its famous murals in the chapel of St. Wenceslaus carefully maintained. Tourists from around the world visit to admire the King of Czech Castles, to walk through rooms where kings once held court and where medieval nobles plotted the future of Bohemia. The castle is a connection to the past, a window into an era of swords and sieges, of faith and feudalism, of art and architecture that modern builders struggle to replicate. Guided tours take visitors through the main chambers, explaining the castle's history, pointing out architectural details, and sharing carefully curated stories that balance historical accuracy with entertainment value. The guides are knowledgeable and professional. They discuss the Přemyslid dynasty, the Rosenberg family, the sieges and the fires, the decline and the restoration. And yes, they mention the ghosts, but typically in a way that's whimsical, part of the castle's charm, legends to smile at rather than genuinely terrifying accounts of supernatural activity. The reality, as we've explored in detail, is considerably darker than the tourist-friendly version presented on standard tours. Zvíkov isn't just a beautiful old building with a few colorful ghost stories. It's a location with consistent, well-documented paranormal activity spanning centuries. The Midnight Death Curse of Hlíza Tower. The Zvíkovský Rarashek, with its history of tormenting visitors. The White Lady wandering in eternal sorrow. The hellhounds in the catacombs. The electromagnetic anomalies, the cold spots, the shadow figures, the equipment failures, and the overwhelming sense of presence that even skeptics acknowledge. What's fascinating is the castle's refusal to be fully explained by either purely supernatural or purely natural theories. The marked stones with their undeciphered symbols are real, physical objects that can be examined and studied, yet their purpose remains mysterious. The electromagnetic anomalies are measurable with instruments, yet they behave in ways that suggest intelligence. The historical traumas, the sieges, the deaths, the violence are documented facts, yet the idea that they could leave spiritual imprints challenges our understanding of how reality works. For some visitors, Zvíkov is simply a stunning piece of medieval architecture, a place to take photographs and learn about Czech history. They walk through the tours, admire the views from the towers, and leave with pleasant memories of a day trip to a beautiful castle. They experience nothing unusual because, for whatever reason, the castle chooses not to reveal its darker side to them. For others, Zvíkov is a genuinely transformative experience, often in unsettling ways. They feel something in those ancient halls, sense presences that shouldn't exist, and leave questioning assumptions they held about the nature of reality. Some become fascinated by the paranormal, inspired to research and investigate. Others are traumatized, vowing never to return, unable to shake the feeling that they encountered something malevolent and ancient that was better left undisturbed. The castle's reputation has made it a pilgrimage site for ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts from across Europe and beyond. They come with their equipment and their theories, hoping to document something definitive, to capture evidence that will prove beyond doubt that Zvíkov is genuinely haunted. Some leave with compelling recordings, photographs, and personal experiences. Others find nothing beyond a beautiful old building. The castle, it seems, reveals itself selectively, or perhaps different people are simply more sensitive to whatever presence inhabits those stones. The question of whether one should visit Zvíkov is complicated by the very real possibility that doing so might expose you to something genuinely dangerous. The curse of Hlíza Tower, if taken seriously, suggests that spending the night in that location will result in your death within a year. Even if you don't believe in curses, the psychological stress of believing you've been cursed could potentially manifest as genuine illness through psychosomatic effects. The imp is credited with causing accidents and injury through its pranks. Even if these are simply natural events that people attribute to supernatural causes, the fact remains that people have been hurt at Zvíkov under circumstances that seemed deliberately orchestrated. Yet thousands visit safely every year, and the castle continues to welcome tourists who wish to experience this remarkable piece of Czech history. The management takes reasonable precautions. The truly dangerous areas, the unstable ruins and the deepest catacombs are off limits to casual visitors. The towers are accessible but supervised. No one is allowed to spend the night in Hlíza, not because the staff necessarily believe in the curse, but because it's been a consistent policy for as long as anyone can remember. And why take chances with legends that have persisted for centuries? For those drawn to Zvíkov, despite its dark reputation, or perhaps because of it, the experience can be profound. Standing in Markomanka Tower and examining the mysterious runic stones, wondering what they meant to the people who carved them over 2,000 years ago. Walking through the chapel of St. Wenceslaus and marveling at murals painted by medieval artists who believed their work was literally under God's watchful eye. Climbing Hlíza and feeling the temperature drop as you ascend, the air growing heavier, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck that warns you something is watching. The view from the towers is spectacular. You can see for miles across the forests and the rivers, across a landscape that has changed remarkably little in essential character since the Middle Ages. Standing there, you understand why this location was chosen for a fortress, why kings considered it worth defending, why armies laid siege to it. You also understand, in a way that photographs and descriptions can never convey, why it feels haunted. The weight of history is almost physical, pressing down on you, the accumulated centuries of human drama played out on this lonely promontory of stone. So what are we to make of Zvíkov Castle and its legend of lords dying at midnight? We've explored the castle's history from its 13th century founding to its modern role as a tourist attraction and paranormal research site. We've examined the midnight death curse of Hlíza Tower, the mischievous and malevolent Zvíkovský Rorashek, the tragic White Lady, the hellhounds in the catacombs, and the shadow figures that seem to move independently through the ancient halls. We've looked at documented sieges and battles, fires and abandonments, the layers of violence and suffering that seeped into stones already marked with mysterious symbols from an even more ancient time. The skeptical explanation would say that Zvíkov's haunted reputation is a combination of natural phenomena, psychological suggestion, and the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random events. Old buildings have temperature fluctuations due to air currents and thermal mass. Electromagnetic fields can be generated by geological formations and affect both human perception and electronic equipment. Sounds echo strangely in stone corridors, creating impressions of footsteps and voices. People who visit supposedly haunted locations are primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as paranormal. The legends persist because people want to believe in ghosts, in curses, in a world that's more mysterious and significant than mere physical matter operating according to natural laws. This skeptical view has merit. We should approach supernatural claims with critical thinking and demand evidence beyond anecdote and personal testimony. Many supposed hauntings have been debunked through careful investigation that revealed mundane explanations for seemingly inexplicable phenomena. But Zvíkov resists simple debunking. The consistency of reports across centuries, involving people from diverse backgrounds with varying levels of belief in the supernatural, creates a pattern that deserves serious consideration. The specific, detailed nature of the phenomena, the imp that pushes and pokes, the white lady who weeps in particular locations, the cold spots that move with apparent intention, these aren't vague feelings of unease. They're concrete experiences that multiple witnesses have described independently. The marked stones with their undeciphered symbols represent a genuine mystery. We don't know what they mean. We don't know why they were carved. We don't know what purpose they served for the people who created them over 2,000 years ago. The idea that they might be necromantic binding spells designed to trap and control spirits is speculative, but it's not absurd. Ancient cultures across the world practiced forms of magic and ritual that modern people struggle to understand. The possibility that Zvíkov was built on or incorporated materials from a site with occult significance can't be dismissed out of hand. The electromagnetic anomalies are measurable, documented phenomena. Whatever is causing them, whether geological formations, residual effects from the castle's construction materials, or something we don't yet understand about how consciousness might interact with physical reality. Something unusual is happening that affects both human perception and electronic equipment in consistent, repeatable ways. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between pure skepticism and complete belief. Perhaps Zvíkov is a location where multiple factors combine to create an environment that's genuinely anomalous. Natural electromagnetic fields that affect perception, architectural acoustics that create unusual sound phenomena, the psychological weight of knowing the castle's violent history, and possibly, just possibly, some form of consciousness or energy that we don't yet have the scientific framework to properly understand or measure. The Midnight Death Curse of Hlíza Tower stands as the castle's most infamous legend, and it remains unresolved. We can't prove that anyone who slept in that tower died within a year, but we also can't definitively disprove it. The legend is old enough and widespread enough that it must have some basis, whether that basis is actual supernatural curse or simply a self-fulfilling prophecy where people who broke the taboo died of stress-related illness brought on by believing they were doomed. What we can say with certainty is that Zvíkov Castle is extraordinary. It's architecturally magnificent, historically significant, and atmospherically unique. Whether you believe in its ghosts or not, whether you think the curse is real or ridiculous, the castle offers an experience that's genuinely powerful. It connects us to the medieval world in a tangible way. It makes us confront our own mortality and our relationship with the past. It asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of life after death, and what might linger in places where intense suffering occurred. If you ever find yourself in the Czech Republic, Zvíkov is worth visiting. Take the tour, climb the towers, examine the mysterious stones, stand in the chapel of St. Wenceslaus, and imagine the medieval worshippers who knelt there, praying for their souls and the souls of their loved ones. Let yourself feel the weight of centuries pressing down on those ancient halls. But perhaps when the tour guide asks if anyone wants to volunteer to spend the night in Hlíza Tower to test the curse for themselves, you might politely decline. Some legends are worth respecting, some towers are meant to remain empty after dark, and some midnights are better spent safely away from places where the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond grows dangerously thin. The lords who died at midnight, if they existed, learned that lesson too late. We, at least, have the advantage of their warning whispered across the centuries in stories that refuse to die. Zvíkov Castle stands. Its stones remember. Its spirits, if they exist, remain. And at midnight, in the Black Tower with its ancient marked stones, something waits. What that something is, what it wants, and what happens to those foolish enough to test its patience, these are questions that Zvíkov keeps locked in its silent ancient heart.